You know, we try to start on time so we can have more fun afterwards. So it's great to see you all. Thank you for coming. I am Paola Antonelli, and some of you are like regulars, so I already know your order, but I'm really, really happy to see you. And for those of you who haven't been here before, I founded this R&D department quite a few years ago. I mean, it's the 10th anniversary of the salons. You know, we started in 2012, yes. Thank you, thank you. But the department was founded a little before, but here we are. You know, these salons exist to prove to the world that museums can be the R&D of society, and that people can come here to think and to also reflect on matters that influence everyone. So on life, death, protesting, getting angry, aging, you name it. And today we're going to talk about a very important matter, very important to all New Yorkers, to people in the world, all over the world, but especially to New Yorkers, the streets. You know, New York is about the street. New York is about interfacing with each other. I remember that somebody told me when I was coming to New York is all about either the sky and the top of the buildings or the ground floor, because the ground floor is where everything happens, and where architecture happens, and where design happens, where surprises and culture happens. And lately, after the pandemic, the life of New York got whammed. New York missed a lot of teeth. You know, you probably all remember these kind of images of the streets of New York boarded up after the lootings that happened, after some of the protests during the pandemic. It was really a dark moment. And you see here some of the streets of Soho. You also see here yours truly over there with the COO of MoMA, that is James Garris. So it's me and him in front of the boarded up store, MoMA store in Soho. So these were the streets on top right after the looting, and at the bottom, right after some artists were given the boards to do their art on. And there were also all of these different art that was added to it that was also related to Black Lives Matter. No matter what, right now it's 2 years later, and some of the streets are still really pummeled and are still really hurting. And how relevant this topic, tonight's topic, is to New Yorkers, you can see from some of the answers to some of the messages and comments that happened when MoMA Instagrammed an announcement of tonight. People were really excited, and it's also quite nice to look at Neil Goldberg. He's a citizen of the East Village that actually posted this really nice video. Can you please start the video, dear friends in the booth? Count of all the stores opening in the morning in the East Village. Thank you. Because he said that he was missing it so much that he really wanted everybody to feel it. So let's go back a little. This idea of the interface of stores and street being so important. Well, the act of buying has always been accessory to the act of coming together, especially in the past. I'm showing here one painting by Peter Bruegel the Elder, just showing a depiction. It was for another allegory, but it's a depiction of a marketplace in the 16th century. So you see already this activity that is brought about by the act of exchanging, buying, and just coming together. And that kind of act has proliferated all over the world. I mean, markets all over the world, from Oaxaca to Delhi to Marrakesh to Barcelona and Tsukiji Market in Tokyo, you name it. You've all been to some of these places. And in these places, it's not only gawking for tourists, it's also really exchanges that happen every day and that create a culture and that also enrich the culture of the place. Well, the act of buying has always existed, but the act of shopping, really, the idea of shopping, is relatively new. It's from the 19th century. The biggest move in that act was the first big department store, which was Le Bon Marché in Paris in the 1850s and 60s. I mean, the stores existed even before, but Aristide Boucicaut bought it in 1852. And in 1869, he bought a really big building in Rue de Sèvres, and he commissioned various architects, including Gustave Eiffel, he of the Eiffel Tower, to actually make this phantasmagoric shopping experience. And yes, an experience it was, which was the first pull towards the idea of either consumerism, if you wish, and that's consumerism, or just making purchases become objects of desire. So this one store was the beginning of it all, and it also influenced not Émile Zola's masterpiece, but one of his novels, one that was called The Paradise of Women's Paradise, and was the novel about the owner of a department store that was actually almost like seducing a young, naive woman by showing her all of these amazing promises and riches of the department store. So it's never ending, but it was just the beginning for so many other department stores all over the world, from Harrods to Bonwit Teller to Selfridges to Saks Fifth Avenue, Wingon and Gimbels, you name it. And it was just this proliferation of stores that created a different relationship with the street. Because, in a way, department stores are places where a lot happens inside, but a lot happens also on the outside. They usually take on whole blocks of cities and give a completely different feel to that particular area. If you think of Knightsbridge in London, it is about the big department stores, and so are many blocks and many areas of Tokyo, and even New York, if you wish. So we'll hear more about this relationship between big department stores and streets in New York later on with some of our wonderful guests. But what is important is to know that we stay in New York now for a moment. While all of these uptown or anyway upscale stores existed for people with money, at the same time, different waves of immigration into the city also created new typologies of retail that mimicked or translated those original of the place that the immigrants were coming from. So from the Lower East Side to Washington Heights to other parts of the city to Queens and Brooklyn, there was a proliferation of these very lively retail spaces where culture from the original places of immigration was actually enriched and was kept alive. So it was really very brilliant and lively to see the coexistence of these different ways of coming together through retail. And that's also where the bodega came from, even though the bodega was a later invention. We are so obsessed as New Yorkers about bodegas. We're really concerned about their disappearance, and rightly so, because when everything else closes, the bodegas open 24 hours a day. And the bodegas were an import of Puerto Rican entrepreneurs from the first wave that came in, especially after World War II. So Washington Heights is the original birthplace of the bodega, even though this work by Joshua Smith represents a Brooklyn bodega. By the way, this is a miniature. So it's a picture, a close-up picture of a miniature of a Brooklyn bodega, an existing one. So it really is a celebration of a New York typology. A different relationship between interior, exterior, city, street, suburbia is the one brought about by malls. Yesterday, there was a really interesting article in the New York Times by Alexandra Lange, who is publishing a book about malls, about their brilliance and their boom and their demise and death, and how they can be actually recycled or reborn for other purposes. But truly, what is interesting about suburban malls is that they were cities unto themselves, with this sense of like public square and almost like a mayoral presence. And then when people like Victor Gruen brought these suburban mall into the city, they created once again a different relationship, not often not very generous towards the outside city, but rather quite entropic. So the malls, and both suburban and urban, are not necessarily one of current models that are most interesting or generous, but we'll see. There's a lot to be discussed. What I would like to move on now to are stores that actually fed into subcultures, or actually helped subcultures be born. I'm showing here a few, and one of our speakers will talk about them a lot, from Keith Haring at Fiorucci. It's also nice to see the artists. By the way, that's where I started working. When I was 13 at Fiorucci in Via Torino, I was selling. So yeah, so it's kind of nice. This was the one in New York, not the one in Milan, but still a storied place. Vivienne Westwood and Malcolm McLaren, the sex boutique in the King's Road that really buttressed punk culture. And then the New Breed Fashion Boutique, 1967 in Harlem, Black Panther's location for the New York style of dashiki, which took all of the West African modes and made them into New York colors, therefore kind of a tweedy or like somber gray and blacks. And Mary Quant in front of her store in the 1960s, that was Carnaby Street, site for Willie Wear, the Willie Smith showroom in 1982, and Dapper Dan, of course, on 125th Street in 1989. So you see all stores that are examples, you know, and here we're choosing only New York and London, but we could go into too many other places that are really keeping subcultures alive and thriving. The relationship between stores and artists is also quite fascinating. As usual, there are many artists that take this topic, and in this case, stores, as a subject. But here we would like to show you how, especially in New York City, artists were often involved in the making of this particular membrane, this particular interface, which is the shop window that is so important in New York City and in so many other parts of the world. Bonwit Teller was very active in this kind of program of involving artists. So we see here an Andy Warhol display at Bonwit Teller in 1961, and then a Lynn Hirschman Leeson that I particularly love, my adored Lynn. You don't see it well here, but that window has a hand of a mannequin pushing through the window and breaking the glass. So people were just like walking by and were really like shocked by it, but it's really quite beautiful. Virgil Abloh at the bottom, a collaboration with Saks Fifth Avenue in 2019 on different kinds of performances. And then I particularly like this one that was at Barney's in 2017, organized by Dennis Friedman. It was Ray Kawakubo and Louise Bourgeois together, juxtaposed, quite daring. Now, there's not too many other places in the world where a combo of Louise Bourgeois and Ray Kawakubo would sell so well, but you know, it's quite interesting. It's a testament to how New Yorkers are really fascinated. I'm proceeding in time, you know, in the 1990s, and actually that's where when one of our speakers tonight and I met, it was Tokyo and it was Harajuku and it was street culture, so from the stores to the streets and back. Now you can see that in many of these places, in many of these stores, people were not really going necessarily to buy. Sometimes it was just to hang out. It was to look at others. It was to be looked at. It was about generating this kind of buzz and new creative ideas that could then proliferate in the world. Of course, the concept store is something that is not new, but that really flourished in a few years in the past, and I'm showing to you some here. Like Colette, of course, that was established in 1997 by Colette Rousseau, and that then was brought forward by her daughter, Sarah Andelman, and it just closed a few years ago. 2017 actually closed 20 years after its founding, much to the sorrow and desperation and despair of so many, not only in the fashion and art world, but everywhere. And then, of course, Dover Street Market by Ray Kawakubo and her husband, Adrienne Joffe, that was founded in 2004 on Dover Street in London and now has stores all over the world, which sell Comme des Garçons, of course, but also many others, many other designers that are loyal to the Dover Street Market brand. Supreme and the Drops, and also our own opening ceremony in New York, established in 2002 and sadly closed, I think, 2 years ago. So all of these different stores that continue this tradition of going not necessarily to buy. I mean, I cannot count how many times I just like hung out at opening ceremony, especially during the sales in the basement when there were all the things that nobody wanted, and just like spending time there looking at things. So all of these stores, well, some are still open, some are in decline, some are completely closed, and it's interesting to wonder what the next wave will be. A lot is happening right now online, and some people say that the demise of the brick and mortar store comes from the proliferation of online stores. I'm not sure that that is actually true, because once again, it's about what a store means to the street. But it's important to discuss a little bit of what's happening online and offline, but not brick and mortar. I mean, I'm always really impressed, and I'm a big fan of Telfar Clemens, who finds all different possible ways of not really selling, but just involving people in his fashion. Telfar TV is a brand new way of selling that is an in-between HGTV and also GVC. Does GVC? I think I might get confused with Italy, but you know what I'm talking about. So selling on TV, because I've just been in Italy, so I'm always bad with acronyms, but you know what I'm talking about. Home Shopping Network or whatever it's called. And now is also going to open a brick and mortar show in Bed-Stuy at some point, to the live shopping experiences that are especially thriving in China, where you can buy directly from live streams. And you see here that in this case, it's with Kim Kardashian. To Grailed, which is a website that collects all sorts of men shopping enthusiasts. It's not only about shopping, but it's also about looking at what is cool and just really knowing what is particularly hot at that moment. And then the 15% pledge, which happened right after Black Lives Matter and was founded by Aurora James, to let retailers declare that they would have at least 15% of the work in the store for sale that was made by a Black-owned brand, because 15% is the portion of the United States that is Black population, that is Black people. So all of these different ways to communicate with the public, in my opinion, do not really go to the detriment of brick and mortar stores. There's other actions, there's other dynamics that are at play that might actually lead us there. But we'll talk about that later. Anyway, we're seeing a lot happening, a lot of atrophy happening. The malls, of course, are dying and need some TLC or demolition, but demolition would be a pity because these structures are quite wondrous and can be reenacted somehow. I mean, I used a few years ago, before they were completely dead, there were a lot of elder groups that were using them to do jogging or like fast walking. I don't know what else could happen there, but certainly a lot. And then, of course, there's also the problem of the Dollar General stores that was highlighted by Alec McGillis, who is a ProPublica writer. He wrote about how the dollar stores are attracting crime and are positioned in such a way, both in streets and in cities, as to attract more crime. So there's a lot of problems that are happening that have to do with like the socio-political makeup of cities and with urban planning. And also there's a lot happening when it comes to the occupation of most stores by chains that replicate a kind of anodyne style that deprives us of this kind of surprise, of like discovery of something new that we've never seen before. Some of them are very highfalutin, like the Apple Store. I was there in 2002 when it happened, and it was Steve Jobs himself that opened it. And of course, it was gorgeous. It still is gorgeous, but it's not very generous and life-giving. It's more life-taking than anything. And even the Prada Epicenter, that was supposed to be a brand new store that Rem Koolhaas and OMA planned together with students from the Harvard Graduate School of Design, publishing this tome that was called Shopping, that was a really cerebral analysis of the way we shop. It was a very ambitious store that was supposed to be a place where a folding stage would also host wonderful conversations that would enlighten everybody's minds, but in truth, it never really worked. And the funny thing also I would like to remember, it was supposed to open pretty much at 9/11, just like the Issey Miyake store in Tribeca. There were a lot of architects that were in town to open stores, and then 9/11 happened, and it took a long time for them all to come online, and maybe also that's one of the reasons why they didn't really get the push that they needed. So maybe that's also what the pandemic is doing to us today. But, an aerial view of Herald Square with Macy's, Verizon, and then H&M, all the various Zara's and H&M, I mean, I don't have we can talk about fast fashion another moment, but it really is, they've taken the place of banks. There used to be a moment where banks were occupying every empty store, sucking the life away from the street. And now it's these stores that are not as toxic as banks, but almost. But this is now what Soho looks like, and that's what downstairs from my home looks like. I live at Broadway and Walker, and all of the people, all the street vendors that were on Canal Street have been pushed away because also Canal Street is being colonized by retail. I mean, I never thought that it would happen. I've been there 18 years, and it's happening, and it's not all bad. But it's something to be observed and to be studied. Well, the last days of Barney's, this is like the saddest picture for a New Yorker that's been here for a while when Barney's closed and so many other stores closed. Also, the store fixtures were for sale. How many of you bought store fixtures from Barney's? I didn't, I have to say. And this kind of like consideration, this kind of obsession, this kind of worry about empty stores, I realize it's not only mine, it's all of you, I'm sure. And Moss, so Michael Meredith and Hilary Sample actually did a whole study about vacant stores in New York City. It's a beautiful book that lists the stores that are empty, that shows that before the pandemic, before COVID-19, 15.3% of the stores were vacant. And right now, it's so much higher. It's so many stores that are vacant. So we all need to think of what to do about it. And that's why we convene today. This idea of brick and mortar being gone, I don't believe it's true, and that's why we're here tonight. I don't believe it's true. I believe it's evolving, and I believe that it might be a distributed kind of power that is necessary right now, a different kind of paradigm. And as usual, we will not get answers tonight, but we will perfect our questions. We have a great panel of speakers. I'm going to go in just like clockwise. I'm going to start with Larissa Ortiz. I'm not going to go into detailed explanation, but Larissa, who is a mayoral appointee at the Planning Commission of New York City and also a director at Street Sense, she will give us the policy, the public policy viewpoint. And then we have John Jay, who's the president of Global Creative at oh my God, it's Federal Retail. Anyway, Uniqlo and fast retailing. I'm so bad with the adjectives. By the way, he and I met in Tokyo many years ago, and we were taking a walk. One of the first times we got to talk, and we walked by a store called Marginal Glamour, which is still in our dreams, right? So, and then we'll have Hazel Clark, who is a professor of fashion history at Parsons at the New School, will give us that kind of historical take, and I hope I haven't screwed up all the titles, but like a guru of fashion history. And last but not least, Claire Weiss, who's an architect at WXY. I can never, WXY, not XYZ, WXY, who is an expert in this kind of mixed use destinations. So they will talk about that, and they will be interspersed with videos by Alec McGillis, he of ProPublica that I just mentioned, Masamichi Katayama, who is the designer of so many great stores like Bathing Ape and just a lot of like counterculture and underculture and subcultures stores, and then Sarah Andelman, who's the daughter of the founder of Colette Rousseau, and last but not least, Mohammed Ahmed and Syed Khalid Basim of Casa Magazines in the West Village. So, yeah, that'll be good. So we're gonna start with the first video with Masamichi Katayama.
今日僕はクリスチャン・マークレーがフィーチャーされた T シャツを着ています。すごく気に入っています。コンデリアソンシャツというブランドから今年リリースされたものなんですが、ちょうど東京で大きなショーも、クリスチャン・マークレーで大きなショーもありました。そのような、僕自身もそのようなことで、商品、プロダクトからアートの情報を仕入れたり、アートの面白さを知ることがあります。 僕の仕事というのはショップ、ブティックだったりカフェだったりホテルだったり、リテールの空間をデザインするのが仕事なんですが、カルチャー、サブカルチャーとの親和性といいますか関係というものをちょっと見直してみたら、一言で言うとなんかインターフェースみたいなことなのかなと思ってるんですね。で、美術館でアートを知る、イベントでアートをちゃんと見るっていうことは当然より深くそれを知ることができると思うんですが、もっとなんか突然予備知識なく、ブティックに入ってなんか出会った T シャツだったり関わってるアートだったり、そういうものが、新しく人々に刺激を与え、なんだろうこれということでより深く知りたくなって次のステップ踏んでいくっていうことがよくあると思います。なんか僕はちょっと状況が違うと思っていて、美術館で見ることと、そのブティックやリテールスペースで見ることが違うと思っていて、なんか予備知識がなくですね、割と今まで知らなかったものがボンと飛び込んでくる衝撃、そういうものを常に用意してくれるのがブティックだったりリテールスペースなんじゃないかなと思います。あと、我々は空間において空間のコンセプトみたいなことをアートに託すこともあります。で、アートがその場でしかない回答をその空間に与えてくれることもあります。そのように、場によって変わるのがアートですし、いいものに変わってくるのがアートだと思うんですが、大きな意味でそのアートをみんなのもとに届けていく、カルチャーをみんなのもとに届けていく役割としてリテールスペースというものは機能しているんじゃないかなというふうに思っています。
Please welcome Hazel Clark.
Hi, everyone, and thanks so much for the invitation, Paula. So I want to begin by taking us back to the late 1950s, when Geraldine Stutz took over as the first female president of this store, the upscale fashion retailer Henry Bendel, then on West 57th Street, and transformed the store's cavernous ground floor space into a street of shops designed by Howard McKim Glazebrook. Here it is, little changed in the 1980s, a series of small boutiques and alleys intended to create a sense of intimate shopping, reminiscent of an urban main street. I offer it as a starting point to think about, first, how relationships between the store and the street mark out our cities, and to think about how ordinary street locations and everyday practices of shopping can be transformed into the extraordinary and the playful through the lens of fashion, and how new communities have formed as a result. Ms. Stutz originally employed future Hollywood film director Joel Schumacher to produce constantly changing window displays. They changed every week, which drew in customers. These are by his successor, Robert Curry, in the 1980s. It reminds us of how the store window can serve as a playful mise-en-scène, providing a flow between the contents within, which we can actually see here, and the street. Stutz's street of shops preempted the many fashion boutiques that were to open in the mid-1960s, distinguishing neighborhoods and providing a distinctive fusion of fashion, commerce, and art. In New York, many were notable for their unexpected and playful names: Teeny Weeny, Splendiferous, Abracadabra, and perhaps most famously, Paraphernalia, which opened in 1965 on the corner of 67th and Madison. Its interior, designed by the modernist architect Ulrich Franzen, was intended to be sleek and futuristic, featuring curved steel and chrome and white walls. It showcased young and fresh design talent, including the likes of Betsy Johnson, and windows again by Joel Schumacher, which here, even in this I apologize, this rather fuzzy slide, they do remind us of the transformative quality of plate glass, which enables the store and the street to visually morph and blend together. The Velvet Underground played at the opening party, reflecting the connections that were developing between fashion and music, and the shop is a venue to see and to be seen, and its clothes offered the possibility of individual transformation. But very soon after it opened, the New York Times reported that uptowners are headed to the Lower East Side, seeking what was different, amusing, and cheap. Downtown, the retail atmosphere was different. Limbo, on St. Mark's Place, had a clientele which included musicians playing at the nearby Fillmore East, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, the New York Dolls, and the whole Warhol crowd. Later, the original location was taken over by Trash and Vaudeville, which some of you might remember, only moved a few years ago. A name befitting its merchandise and its situation, originally between a bathhouse and the Valencia Hotel, a favorite location of sex workers. The atmosphere around St. Mark's was grungy, but electric, and it gained the neighborhood its own name, the East Village. These stores also stocked second-hand clothes, starting their transformation into fashion. Fashion and music were strongly connected to the development of independence of style, and it's likely that the military band leader style jackets worn by the Beatles on the cover of the Sgt. Pepper's album were inspired by actual ex-military jackets sold at Limbo. Similar jackets could be bought on in London's Carnaby Street at wonderfully named shops such as I Was Lord Kitchener's Valet. Tucked behind Liberty's and off Regent Street, Carnaby Street provided a contained space, originally only for those in the know. The relationship between the street and the store became more vibrant as young people experimented with their fashion identities, and as fashion designers experimented also. Sex, which we've already seen, was opened in 1974 at World's End, the wrong end of Chelsea's King's Road, far from fashionable Sloane Square, and also from the nearest underground station. Vivienne Westwood and Malcolm McLaren's shop not only transformed its location, it put fashion and music together, and was altogether irreverent at the same time. It was said that the store's walls were scrawled with graffiti from the Scum Manifesto, the radical feminist writings of Valerie Solanas, and its sales assistant, Jordan, who you see here, became the face of the store in her rubber clothes and theatrical makeup. British Rail put her in a first-class carriage during her daily commute to and from her job and her parents' home in Essex, they said for her own protection. Formerly named Let It Rock, Too Fast to Live, Too Young to Die, and then later Seditionaries, Clothes for Heroes, the store and its stock had strong links, of course, to music, but also to popular culture. But also its sense of change had this sensibility also of something unfixed, and in many ways preempted what was to follow, namely the pop-up or the guerrilla store. The first shop opened by Rei Kawakubo in Berlin in 2004 became the poster child for stores, well, just popping up, just for a while, in unexpected locations, offering the possibility to transform neighborhoods. Already in 1999, Kawakubo and Adrian Joffe had, of course, opened Comme des Garçons on West 22nd Street, a choice that preempted the Gallery District, and, of course, with this wonderful sign, The Heavenly Body Works, which I'm sure we know. Similarly, with Dover Street Market, which we've already seen, it was established not here, but originally in London's Mayfair, the private gallery area. When it moved to the Haymarket that we see here and elsewhere, the original name remained, transforming, or at least confusing and unfixing the city and the significance and hierarchy of its geographies. In New York, on 160 Lexington, it was tucked away, or is tucked away, between 30th and 31st Street. And there, the Dover Street Market could be said to have made an ordinary and undistinguished part of the city, which was just for passing by, passing through, something more extraordinary, and also incidentally in an old bank building, just for that reference. The market concept has also been important to the stores, gallery-like spaces, but also a sense of the agora for meeting and gathering, the cafe on the ground floor, providing a place to linger, to browse at magazines, and to stay. Building a community, as well as transforming the city, also characterized opening ceremony, which of course we've already seen, which opened in 2002 on a quiet street in Soho, Howard Street. The dream of its founders, Carol Lim and Umberto Leon, was to connect people from all over the world, taking its name from the opening ceremony of the Olympic Games. In closing in 2020, the founders sent an Instagram message to their large community saying that the store became a hangout and a meeting place for so many different visitors and locals who came by to find out what was happening in New York, because you could always get the scoop when you shopped. So in ending with another store that's closed, maybe I've just completely undermined the argument about the continuing relationships between the store and the street and their vibrancy. But I'm not sure. I think maybe evidence suggests to the contrary. In April of this year, Kirby Jean Raymond chose to place a billboard advertising Pia Moss's new line of handbags, not in Manhattan, not in Times Square, but on Church Avenue in Flatbush in Brooklyn, his home neighborhood and quite near mine. For me, this represented another act of transformation and a demonstration of the continuing vibrancy of the relationship between the street and retail, seen through the lens of fashion. It's a kind of urban shapeshifter, which opens up the city, draws attention to the extraordinary qualities of the everyday, references community, and infuses it all with a dash of playfulness. Thank you.
Well, we have the next video. It's Sarah Andelman.
To reply your question about concept store and the shifting in retail, I would say that back in the days we had the department stores with all the different corners, and we had a specialty store, local stores. And with Colette, we looked, when we opened back in 97, there was shop we looked like Moss in New York with an amazing design selection, or Joseph, a fashion shop in London who had a restaurant. And we fall in love with this location on Rue Saint-Honoré, and we decided to bring everything we liked, from fashion to design, beauty, food, music. And there was non-stop events, and windows will change every week. And there was no rules. It was just to support creative talents we would find everywhere and give them a platform, a way to show their work. And I think nowadays concept store is more a curated store. I never fall close from concept. It doesn't mean anything, I think, except to maybe mix different categories. And with curated stores, meaning we would pick every single object and they would be part of a specific story we would want to say. And now we see lots of no more multi-brands concept store, but mono-product store. And I think of Jacques Mus with his great installation with only one bag, and he would dedicate a space just for one product. I also think nowadays in retail we see lots of brands which were supposed to sell only online, who will open their own brick and mortar shops, because of course it's a different experience. And slowly but surely we would see all the brands giving this experience in their shops, and also the big department store with always finding ideas to create this entertainment, because we need more than retail. We need another dimension.
Yeah, well, help me welcome Larissa Ortiz.
Here it is. Hi, thank you so much. I'm really pleased to be here and talk a little bit about what's happening, at the risk of pulling back and stepping outside of the store and stepping into the street, and perhaps looking at this from the 30,000-foot level, because retail is part of a really delicate ecosystem. It doesn't exist without shoppers, and we've just been through, a tremendous 2 years of COVID. There's tremendous disruption in this field, and some of the challenges that we're facing have to do with where the customers have gone. So I want to talk about that today. Okay. And I'm going to talk about a few trends that we've been seeing in our work that maybe will root our discussion for a little later. The first is not a surprise to anyone. I'm coming from my home office in Jackson Heights, Queens today. People have changed how they're working. It's not work from home, it's work from anywhere, and it's here to stay. And this is because there are powerful economic forces at play here, both for employees and employers. For employees, it's saved time in commuting, saved money in commuting. For employers, it's saved resources. There's been research that's done that if an employer actually reduces their real estate footprint and right-sizes it for a hybrid worker, they can save $11,000 annually. Multiply that by hundreds and thousands of workers in a business district, and you can see how there are real estate implications. And in fact, this is probably why the commercial real estate industry is shaking in their boots right now. And our central business districts in particular are going to feel this pain. That is where we're going to see a tremendous decrease in spending. And when we look at New York, Los Angeles, and San Francisco, where we have professional office workers, folks who can in fact work from home, those are the places that are going to see a decrease in spending particularly. And I think that's where we're going to see an impact on retail, and we are seeing it now. In fact, some of the research we saw earlier really brings to bear. So that spending has not disappeared, it's just shifted. And it's shifted to the places where people live. So our residential neighborhoods have really proved themselves to be quite resilient. And when we look at neighborhoods outside of our central business districts during the pandemic, in fact, those neighborhoods, the sales of businesses in those neighborhoods remained relatively stable compared to that of our central business districts. So what happens? How do we build a better mousetrap and make sure people, whether they're working, living, and playing, come back to our cities? I think that is the existential question of our time. How do we make sure, and I'm a New Yorker, how do we make sure New York in particular remains its status as sort of the global premier city? I think we have to think about all the characteristics that make place a great place for people to work and live, and I'm going to talk about each of these in kind. First, culture. It's not a surprise we're here at MoMA talking about this. When we ask CEOs what is it that makes them want to locate in an urban environment like New York, Facebook just recently signed a lease for over 700,000 square feet of retail space. What do they say? Culture, art, media, commerce, these are all things that are really critical to their decision to locate in a place like New York. And when we look at some of the office buildings that continue to do very well, One Vanderbilt, which is immediately adjacent to Grand Central, it's highly accessible. So all of those workers who now can live 1, 2, 3 hours away can come into Grand Central, they walk across the street, and there's a reason why that building is nearly full. And then we think about younger workers who want urban places. They are probably living with roommates. They probably want to go to the office a little bit. They want to go out. And the city remains a wonderful place for them and a place that offers a quality of life. And when we think about, actually today I was reading the Real Deal, and they were talking about how East Midtown is now seeing a lot of apartments are being sold to local and younger people. And then broadband access. I was shocked by the statistic that the average US household owns about 11 connected devices. We have to make sure that all these people who are shopping online, who are working from home, or working in their offices need connectivity, that the city provides the kind of broadband network that they need. We also need to make sure that our businesses that locate here have access to a deep labor pool within 1, as I said, 2 or 3 hours of their downtowns. And then it doesn't hurt to be in a nice environment. In fact, we've seen double-digit rent growth in places like Tampa and Charlotte, in warm places. We can't really compete in New York, but that's okay. And then finally, transportation. I'm a transportation geek at the heart of it. I think that if we create environments where shoppers can easily get to stores and easily leave stores, arrival and departure is so important. We've really created a great opportunity for our retail. And I'm particularly excited by the growth in e-mobility that we've seen during COVID. E-scooters, e-bikes. If you can e-scoot for 5 minutes as opposed to walking for 5 minutes, that business all of a sudden has a much, much larger area from which to draw customers. So I'm going to go over a few sort of tools, and these are very practical tools for communities who want to make sure they're building a better mousetrap. One is we need to prioritize the public realm as an amenity for offices, for residents, making sure that we're creating a fun place for people to go back to work, or else they're not going to go back to work and they're not going to spend in our businesses. And our business improvement districts, I think, have done a great job. We have this wonderful Instagrammable roller rink in Philadelphia, and in Virginia, the Rosalind BID developed an outdoor office concept. They're embracing the role of public space. We also need to make sure the city is smart, that we're supporting broadband and investments in infrastructure, and that when you tear up a street, you only dig once and you put broadband in when you do that. And the communities that we live in have to be communities of choice. We want people to want to live in our cities because then they'll be spending money in our cities. That means investments in parks, public spaces, and of course our cultural offerings, which are unequal. And we need to think about zoning regulations and the kinds of things that are making it very difficult for businesses to locate in our communities. And I won't get into this. I'm a planning commissioner here in the city of New York, but that's a very, very big topic for many communities. And finally, I think we have to acknowledge that retail is going to struggle for the foreseeable future, particularly in our central business districts. And we have to figure out how to activate these empty spaces while we figure out what else to do with them. And that means camouflaging them. And these are opportunities also for culture and art. Mobility infrastructure, I think, is key, supporting bike networks and getting people to and from our business districts. And supporting partnerships with the private sector, developing programs to subsidize e-bike purchases. I mean, they're wonderful ideas that are going to help us embrace mobility in our communities. So with that, I want to thank you, and hopefully we'll have a good discussion after this.
Thank you. Thank you, Larissa, for packing so much in 7 minutes. So the next video is Alec McGillis.
So here's what happens when Amazon comes to your town. This is what happens when it came to my town, Baltimore, in 2014. The big warehouse goes up out on the edge of town. It's enormous. It's about 1/3 of a mile long. You can fit about 18 football fields inside of it. There are about 14 miles of conveyor belts running through it. There are, at any given time, 14 million items waiting to be packaged. There are about 100 packages per minute flying down the conveyor belts. There are $43 million worth of tax credits that the state and city give to Amazon to build that warehouse. There's a big grand opening where the mayor and the congressman come out and praise Amazon to the heavens, not just for bringing these new jobs, but for bringing them their deodorant and moisturizer on time. The mayor and congressman praising them for that dependability. It's not hard to see why they're so excited to have them there. These new jobs are replacing jobs that were lost at the enormous steel mill, at the auto plant. And in fact, the first warehouse is replacing the auto factory, the GM factory that shut down a few years earlier. And then the next warehouse is replacing the steel mill, what was once the largest steel mill in the world, now an Amazon warehouse on the exact same site. But those new jobs, of course, are paying less than half of what the jobs that they replaced were paying. And it's not just that, they're also infinitely less fulfilling, rewarding, purposeful jobs. So much less camaraderie. I talked to one guy who spent more than 30 years in the steel mill doing incredibly dangerous work in the steel mill. It was so dangerous, but he found it rewarding. He stuck with it for more than 30 years. He was making $30 an hour by the time he retired. He comes back to work at Amazon, making less than half as much, driving a forklift there, feeling so much less camaraderie and purpose than what he'd felt back at the steel mill job on the exact same piece of land. And he barely lasted a couple years at the Amazon job. Turnover at these warehouses is on average about 100% in a given year. That means just about everyone is not lasting more than a year because the job is that draining, that rudimentary, that unfulfilling. That Amazon warehouse at the steel mill has now been joined by 2 others. There are now 3 Amazon warehouses on that single peninsula that used to hold the world's largest steel mill outside of Baltimore. This is how your town becomes a warehouse town.
Let's give a warm welcome to Claire Weiss.
Thank you, everyone. Now I'm going to try and put together both a little bit of a historical perspective and a little bit of kind of where I see the data, but really from the point of view of an architect living and working in New York City. And that may seem extremely local, and I'm going to make sure that I know. Let's see, which is the button right here? Great. Wonderful. So public space has become an emergent issue over the last 15 years in New York. And in a sense, it's become a very fuzzy issue too, because I love the word public space because no one knows what it means. And so when you, looking at Elizabeth Michaels' work, and I think the New York Times talked a little bit about these fellows, the Design Trust for Public Space, these photo-urbanism fellows, who took their own neighborhoods and started to look at the street and kind of what retail and commerce they were seeing during COVID. And in her case, I think her mother owns this fabric store. And you can kind of see that the commerce that's happening on streets in neighborhoods where people are living and working is vital, vibrant. And this is a very different thing, and I'm not going to talk about, as an architect, the last store that we designed before COVID. So it opened April 10th, I think. And anyways, 4 days. The Veja store in Soho, right before it shut down. And what was kind of important, we don't design a lot of stores, but what was really important to me at the time was trying to figure out what the store window meant. And of course, and in a lot of ways, it was already, in 2020, a balance between, is the store window a display, or is it really kind of picking up the fabric of the buildings? Or is it kind of getting people to enjoy the fabric of the city so that they have an experience distinct from just ordering a pair of Veja shoes on the internet to their home, right? So that, like, these were the questions before the pandemic really got into force. And they were the same questions when we designed the Drawing Center in 2012, because the burning question for the Drawing Center was, Soho is full of stores. All of the galleries have left for Chelsea. What does the Drawing Center do? Because it can't look like a store, but it has to find a way to engage people in the street. And really the solution there was to basically say, those old loading docks that people add stairs to, people want to hang out in. So, okay, 2012. And that instead of having a front security desk, you try and kind of tell people about your publications, and you make a space that kind of is part of the gallery, but also part of the street. So the same strategy in kind of working through, and this is a project that started well before the pandemic and won't be opened until we're not wearing masks anymore, which is later this year. As other neighborhoods started to realize that they could do new cultural centers in the Bronx, in Brooklyn, we saw, in Queens, the mixed use live, work, play culture of the city is a lot more engaged than maybe it was in Midtown. And the facts actually support this, as Larissa has shown. And the investments in affordable housing that the city have made have required developers to put things on the ground floor that they might not be stores, or sometimes they are stores, but there are places that people are using that kind of inspire businesses. And it's sort of, this is a picture of this under construction, the Bronx Music Hall. This is this is the South Bronx. There's a couple of new cultural buildings going in as well as part of 100% affordable housing. But literally, Bronx Music Hall set up shop and started to post on YouTube performances in front of a construction site because there was enough of a facade. The same thing happened when Uber asked us to organize a group of people to help Strivers Row's restaurants build things. It was really difficult during the pandemic for restaurants to get enough money together to do something good. And, this just shows some of the press, but 3 different architects, 2 artists, and 3 separate restaurants, 3 or 4 restaurants, all did very different things. They didn't do the same thing, but they're still up. You can see the Renaissance Pavilion. This is Brant Hafford's work. And now I'm leaving the restaurants and stores, and I think asking the big question for all of us. This happened all over the country, that streets got painted, reimagined, and they attracted people. And there was actually, food trucks would show up, people would have work. In this case, it was Tat's crew, painting for 3 different emerging artists. And for the first time at Foley Square, unlike in Brooklyn and Fulton in front of Bed-Stuy Restoration, there were tons of people. But there's not a lot of people that showed up in Foley Square except to protest. And I think that sense of there's a lot of room in the streets. Why aren't we doing more with them? Is an emergent issue in cities all over, but in particular glaring in New York, where for a long time cars were more important than people. And even now, most of what we're kind of looking at and wondering why it doesn't work, it usually doesn't work because there's way too many cars parked in front of stores, or merchants can't sell food on the street because there's garbage there. So like many efforts all over the country, our firm looked at strategies for keeping the tables turning, which meant helping restaurants. This actually was used in cities all over the United States, in India as well, to kind of help restaurateurs with small grants from Uber kind of make kits work. So a lot of these kind of how do you roll out a restaurant stuff has emerged as a sort of vocabulary of stuff. So I'm going to go back to the street. There's a lot of space on our streets. It's really filled with cars. And we do have to redesign them to make more room. This will help kind of that exchange of retail happen and create places that I think is the real emergent issue about where retail will be in terms of placemaking. This kind of shows how much space we can all make. And back to Brooklyn. In downtown Brooklyn, we have some of the same problems, which is you can't bike down Fulton Street, and even the stores that do really well, there's not enough room. Our sidewalks are too narrow. And this kind of reimagining of the streets themselves ultimately starts to kind of encourage people to sell and buy outside of stores. What it means for the stores themselves is unclear, but I would argue, and I'm going to end up with one last case in the Bronx, I would argue that if people are living and making things in kind of communities that are not just residential, or not just retail, like a mall, or not just office, like Midtown, there's a greater chance of reinvention. So the Peninsula proposes, and some people here were involved in it, like Paul Lipson, that you could make food and sell food in an affordable housing neighborhood that also is an industrial neighborhood. And that the public space, ultimately public space, the ability to go up a step street or be in a plaza, that these are potentially the storefronts of the future, which are spaces that are handling waste and spaces that you're delivering things from and how they get used on the weekends. So I know my time is up, but hopefully some of this visual diary of New York helps promote a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. And now we go to our superstars at Casa Magazines.
Hi everyone, to Mohammad. My name is Muhammad from Casa Magazine. I'm working since 95 here. Hi Ali, why is important Casa Magazine?
Hi, this is Ali, New York, West Village. Everybody, peace and love. And Casa Magazine is important. Then a lot of people, right? They go park, they come Casa Magazine, they enjoy. They never see any place in the whole Manhattan city just like a Casa Magazine. Casa Magazine history is over 85-year-old. Is unique and a special place in West Village. And if you have stress out, you come to the Casa Magazine. If you are depressed, you come to the Casa Magazine. It's not you just buy the magazine. You talk to Muhammad, you talk to me. We have family issue, we have job issue. We have so much to be understand about each other things, you know.
Matrimonial issue.
Yes. And the people, so many museum in West Village, but before they go to the museum, they come to the Casa Magazine and ask where is the location of the museum. If you Google, come to the Casa place first and then museum, all right?
I have to say, I was lucky enough as to be truly their neighbor. I was living down the block, so I spent a lot of time talking about matrimonial issues with them. All right, please help me welcome John Jay.
And by the way, John is being filmed for a documentary, so if
You see weird camera people going around, very weird. That's why.
So a marriage of inspiration here. Let's see if I can get to that marriage here. 1939, Salvador Dali. What an amazing relationship between street and retail there. And there he is, the master, making the window. And Michel Landy, 1992, a very, very important exhibition because it was speaking exactly of what was happening to American retail at that time. And Mr. Warhol, lock up a department store today, open the door after 100 years, and you will have a museum of modern art. So a department store was the origin, I think, of the modern trusted brand. And they were all significant pillars of the community representing all aspects of the American family and its aspirations. This store, and let me just go back 1 second here. Can I go back one? On the green, the little red or green? Yeah, little red. Little red, sorry. So this statement, the American department stores were the first to train women in upper management. At the time when you wanted to be a buyer, you weren't just crunching numbers on a screen out of B school. You had to take cultural lessons and art lessons.
the microphone, John.
The microphone, please. Sorry. So I think about the great American department stores and the restaurants. They were the gathering places of family, working women. It was an extraordinary time. The L, the train that ran through the Upper East Side, that changed the light. Before the L came down, Bloomingdale's couldn't sell fashion. Furniture was the only way in. Look at the light. Look at the difference on the Upper East Side. But once this came down, the whole world changed. An entire neighborhood became reality. 1975, this is what happened. In 1975, it was said in the New York Times, there's two places where you can meet attractive young people to have a good social life. Bloomingdale's, the Saturday's Generation, and the other place, the Museum of Modern Art. We talk about the street, the action on the streets. Look at the action on the street here. This is the action that was happening in London just a week ago, and there she is, the Queen, visiting Bloomingdale's at 59th and Lex. And then the stores, the incredible model rooms of Barbara D'Arcy This is one of her favorite rooms. This is the kind of quarterly change of all the rooms and bringing the latest ideas in furniture and architecture and design. My own introduction, this room, when I walked in and discovered Frank Gehry. I didn't know who he was. It was the department store that brought this, 1978. And I promised to only show 2 pieces of my work, and here they are. The Japan promotion for Bloomingdale's and Otorisatsu's for the Memphis movement for Bloomingdale's. So these bags for a decade were on the streets 4 times a year, and I would change them according to whatever the zeitgeist of culture was telling us. And these shopping bags, of course, were famously had no name of the store, no identification, no logo, and they're constantly changing. Each bag was a statement of culture. So now the store and Wall Street became, instead of a marriage, became a divorce of creativity. And what happened? Ask this man. He won a Nobel Prize. Who am I to question, right? Mr. Milton Friedman. I apologize for my typography here. Those negative spaces are mistakes, not art. So the great American department store, such as Federated Stores, lost their way after Wall Street's aggressive takeover actions in the late 1980s. The Friedman Doctrine, which is a normative theory of business which holds that the social responsibility of business is to increase its profits. And this shareholder primacy approach views shareholders as the economic engine of the organization and the only group to which the firm is socially responsible. In 1988, $6.6 billion takeover of Federated Department Stores and Federated Department Stores by the Campo corporations, and then by 1990, less than 2 years, Federated and Allied Stores file for bankruptcy. Do you know how many hundreds, if not thousands, of jobs were lost in this process? The store in the street, and what is the new normal? So in the past decade, the problem was not that America was overstored, but America had too many stores without a distinct point of view and vision. Management tried to mimic the success of others, while the power shifted to those without imagination. If you were a bean counter, you were in power. Creative leaders lost their power. They lost their seat at the table. And culture was replaced by marketing. Retail is really about this culture of people, of feeling a sense of belonging, said Frame magazine. And of course, this has been repeated all afternoon here. Here's some examples. Vanke Times Center in Beijing. This was a former shopping mall turned into mixed-use creative urban complex, blending retail, office with grand art installations and cultural space. This was in 2018. This is before COVID. So the movement had already started around the world. This, you're all familiar with, Saks Works. I mean, it's unbelievable that Saks Fifth Avenue now is a WeWork space. It's nice that the furniture is right around the corner. You just pick your furniture and then outfit your office. But Saks Works is a co-working space operated by Hudson Bay Company, the owner of Saks, and WeWork. And they currently have 4 locations. Another use. This is the Google West Side Pavilion. Google is using this West Side Pavilion, which used to be a staple shopping mall, into one of its campuses now. And it will transform this 80s mall Eastern Wing into a 584 square foot office space with on-site parking and open spaces. So 3 very different uses of the department store and malls. So a radical future. What could that be? Well, as a creative person, I'm saying this. Actually, bring back the great American department store, not in its former form exactly, or products. I just want to bring back those kinds of leaders. Bring back the merchant. Remember the merchant, the person who was genius about product and stores and service and cared about the customers and what happened on the street? Bring back their value and values. Bring back institutions with a truth and a purpose and a respect for all people. That is great retailing, respect for all people. and bring back ideas of quality instead of this damn chasing of trends and social media followers, and bring back community presence with personal service. And before we fantasize about the metaverse, let's try being respectful and honest and surprising in real time, with real people, with real value, in real stores, in real neighborhoods. And before we think outside of the box, let's fix the damn box first. Creative leaders must earn a seat at the table. Creativity and marketing are not synonymous. I'm sorry. Marketing can be creative, but it's not exactly the same. And start not with store design, but with a foundation of great products and personal service. It's not what the store looks like, it's what does it represent, what is the concept, and what is the purpose of this store. Why do you exist? Now that's radical. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. And now I would like to call you all here to have a conversation, debate. Let me take all of my bits and pieces. Here we are. All right. So this was wonderful. Now, I would like to know how we do that, but we'll get to it. So let's start. These were all great presentations, but I would like to start with one of the videos because I think that the first video by the founder of Wonderwall was amazing in that it talked about, it kind of really hit the nail on the head by talking about the fact that stores are places where innovative radical culture is delivered to the customer without the customer even realizing it, just like a hit on the head. And I'm wondering right now, and then you talked about surprise, John. I had written down surprise, and then you said surprise. So, Hazel, do you see that kind of surprise happening in stores, like brick and mortar stores, and where? Just start talking, and then it magically.
I think it's, as I was suggesting, happening in unexpected places.
I thought it was going to go on, but instead it's not. Oh, it's going on? Okay, yeah, sorry.
So I think it's happening where we don't look for it, as I was saying with some of the examples we know, like opening ceremony, but even, in my neighborhood, which is sort of on Flatbush, there's little, stores, coffee shops, local, clothes stores. So I think we don't necessarily have to look in the same places. And, you mentioned the New York bodega. I mean, there is a lot of street life. And it's actually those smaller spaces. The local store I'm thinking of, it has clothes, it has objects. In the summer, till the police stopped it, it had makeshift barbecue, out of oil drums on the street. So I think that, there is a lot of life where there's community and where people living and wanting to be with one another, and that still exists.
That's the surprise. What about the subcultures? Are there places that still support them?
I think we now think of subcultures a bit like some of your slides, very much related to retail, and to Supreme and things. But I think the subculture still comes from what kids are doing, I mean, it was skateboarding. I don't know. I mean, I'm not of that age now, and even I think even my son's sort of outgrown what is the latest. But yeah, I think it's just what people are choosing to do. I think that's where the subcultures come from, and as I was suggesting historically, even now, it's a blend of play and music and fashion and image. So, but it's very much people gathering together. So I would still say, but I can't tell you the next. Next subculture.
No, thank you. And I'm going to go to Larissa. When we were talking to prepare for tonight, I mentioned the myth of the landlord that doesn't want to rent the empty storefront because doesn't make enough money and because they get more money out of marking off their losses. And you told me, Paula, that's a myth. It's not really how it works. So let's dispel that myth because that concerns us all. What's the truth about these empty storefronts that remain empty for a really long time?
Yeah, it's the myth of the greedy landlord.
The myth of the greedy landlord, I know.
It's always the greedy landlord. We work in a lot of underserved communities. in the outer boroughs where landlords are immigrant owners, they're small business owners. They are really reliant on the rent in their spaces and often are much more flexible with their rent than institutional owners. So I think people sometimes confuse institutional owners who have deeper pockets, can wait for the right tenant, have certain expectations on rent, and perhaps can leave a space vacant for a little longer than our smaller property owners who often do not have that luxury. So I think it's just important that we sort of dispel with the gritty landlord narrative and begin talking about the challenges of space and recognizing that in some cases space is empty, not because not because of anything else other than the market. There may not be sufficient market demand to fill that space. There may not be tenants to fill that space. I talk to owners all the time who would love to have users in their space. And I say users intentionally because it's not just retail anymore. Retail is much broader than that. But I think we're facing a reckoning right now where vacancy is not because of something a landowner or a property owner is doing, but rather because there are market conditions that are creating vacancies at a scale that we probably have never seen before.
But institutional owners are greedy, right? They're like
I won't say
they're like adorers, idolizers of Milton Friedman, meanies. No, I'm just kidding. Claire, public space. I'm not kidding. Public space and the definition of public space. I would like to ask you about some famous public spaces, like the space at Rockefeller Center, for instance. There's been a big change there lately, or at least an attempt at change. How do you see these public spaces that were traditionally defined so being activated? Because you talked about public spaces that were created ad hoc, and instead the ones that have been there forever.
Well, I want to contrast space like Rockefeller Center with some of the markets you showed.
Mm-hmm.
So if we think about where the stores of the future come from, they start small. They could be a vendor on the boardwalk. They could have been at Fordham Plaza, the vendor market there. And then they kind of build up a following, and then they could turn into a store. I mean, that's how it used to be. And the Lower East Side, people would have a very well-done store. They could eventually buy their building. They might still be there because they own their building. Rockefeller Center is all owned, not by the public, but by a corporate owner. We'll get back to the landlord. It's programmed by a corporate owner, not a bed. And as wonderful as some of the cool things they're bringing in, it wouldn't be what I would call public space for that reason. And it's interesting, but it won't have the dynamism of an actual market, like the one you showed in Taiwan. There was a market that was under the FDR for a long time called the New Amsterdam Market.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so that was a market. Many of the people in that market's products I buy today. And so that really, I think we have to really talk about, back to okay, so where are the new businesses? Who can afford to be a business? And where are the customers for those businesses?
Sorry.
Because under bridges, under the elevated, those spaces that are public, people don't have to pay to be there. But in many other, Hudson Yards, I think you would be paying if you set up a stall there, or you couldn't do it at all. I would say Rockefeller Center, you would have to pay to program there. So that's not, it doesn't have necessarily if I go to Queens, there's some really interesting new stores because, again, small landlords and people having an idea and just starting stores.
And just wonder, because I know some people that work at Rockefeller Center that are trying to bring in the kind of stores that you would find in Brooklyn because they realize that having the chain stores is ultimately draining also potential away, which is fascinating. So I have to
Well,
rotate.
like Dina
There are so many
DeLuca.
questions about this.
Dina DeLuca is an
Oh my
interesting
God, Dina,
case
yeah.
because they started in Soho, also
Mm-hmm.
very interesting vision, not clothes, but various products, and they moved to Rockefeller Center and were very successful. So I think if you build up the right business, Rockefeller Center is an amazing kind of, like Times Square is, a platform. So public space can be a wonderful platform.
Gotcha. John, how do we bring back the merchant? How do we convince people to come back? Because, even a few days ago, I was thinking, oh, look at that space. Maybe I should open a store. And then, what the hell, right? I was like, no. So how do you make people...
Well, there's plenty of great merchants, young merchants. They just are not going through the traditional route. They're not going to B school, all right, number one. Slightly different kind of merchant. Well, I go back to I capitalized merchant. Once I sent a note to Howard Schultz after seeing a documentary, and I said, Howard, you're the ultimate...
Tell people who Howard Schultz is.
Oh,
I'm
sorry.
sure they know, but just in case, like a journalist.
Starbucks, founder of Starbucks.
Starbucks guy.
And I said, after watching your documentary, Howard, I think you're one of the ultimate merchants. He emailed me immediately because John, that is the highest accolade anyone could ever give to me, the merchant, the real merchant, the person that runs a store with love and passion and knows everything like a kitchen, like a restaurant. Up front of the house, back of the house, knows every single piece of operation, but especially loves the creation of product and the service that goes with it. So let me just get off. Please watch a show on TV, not mine, on Netflix called Somebody Please Feed Phil. And they're visiting Portland, Oregon. And what he was shocked, he said, this is undoubtedly the greatest food I've ever tasted out of the smallest kitchens I've ever seen in America. Everything is a tiny little cart, but the quality of the food is extraordinary. And that's what gave, prior to COVID and everything, Portland's great reputation and so forth. So I think the merchant has to come from within. I think I was trying to make these analogies that that marketing replaced culture. Culture comes from a different place. Marketing comes from a different. So I think the where the passion comes from. You're asking about subcultures. Well, with the internet, there's nothing sub. It only stays sub for about 30 seconds. That's the problem. We, me included, commodify this stuff so quickly. So we have to be careful. We have to respect that. But the subcultures still exist, and I think the great merchants come from there.
Great statement. Hazel, there are quite a few of your students in the audience tonight. And I'm wondering if you have conversations with them about retail, and what you learn from them about how retail is changing.
Well, I think, I suppose it follows from what John's saying, how retail is changing is buying things that you don't physically encounter, which
you don't
encounter it while you buy first and then you encounter the thing, which it ages me, but I just found very strange. So I just think that whole notion of how you shop, and that you shop virtually, and that the store, going back to some of your examples, is much more of a flagship or a gallery space. But I think that different relationship with, and of course, just the speed of shopping. And speaking of students trying not to do it in classes, my students don't do that actually. But I'm saying that because that ease,
But
so
they could, you could be showing something
they
from
never
they
never do that.
live shopping with Hazel. No?
But yeah, that ease.
The new Weibo channel.
I'm looking for a new occupation. But yeah, I think that just that ease, but not shopping a thing, just shopping an image, a concept, and something you see from the front. It's
very different. Yeah, I agree. So I'm trying to speed up my questions because I know you have them too. But I really like how all these different viewpoints came together tonight. And Larissa, you were talking about the city truly as an organism. And I'm from Milan. Just came back from Milan. I've been living in this place for 40 years. That is, Milan is concentric. There's a center, and then there are all these different rings. I live on the first ring. But something weird happened. The radials coming out from the center, there are some that are thriving, and some that have lost all of their blood and almost are in gangrene right now, which, of course, lucky as I am, is my radial. And for some reason, all the stores are closed there. Then on other radials, it's all Zara's and H&M's. And other radials instead are super rich stores for like bougie Milanese people. And the last radial is finally vibrant and creative. So interesting. How would you, as an urban planning expert, go about resuscitating my dead radial? You know what I'm saying? It's really, you must be encountering these issues. So how do you go about that?
Absolutely. I think there are two things. One is retail follows rooftops.
Rooftops.
So
Yay.
when you create an environment, and this is why I think quality of life is so critical, why creating communities of choice is so critical. If people choose to move someplace, retail will follow. And so investment in neighborhoods, investment in communities, investment in infrastructure, investment in schools, investment in public space. All of these create the conditions and the characteristics that make people want to live there, make people want to work there. It's why I felt it was necessary to step back and discuss that piece of the puzzle, because I think it's sometimes forgotten in the discussion of retail. We can't just drop retail anywhere. It has to go where people will visit and shop. And I think it's interesting, the example earlier of the sex store, which was at, what is the wrong section, the wrong end,
World's End.
of King's.
World's End, yeah.
Yeah. We talk about merchants, bringing merchants back. How do we do that? It's about hurdle to entry. How do we create and make it easier for undercapitalized small businesses to overcome the lack of resources they may have to open a business?
Yeah.
The rent. So sometimes you'll find interesting concepts in off-rent locations. They're not going to go to Rockefeller Center, never. They're not going to be on Fifth Avenue.
When it comes to Dover Street Market and even opening ceremony.
So side streets are often where businesses try and fail, or try and succeed, and then they relocate to main streets. And I think that that cycle of invention, it's anyone who's testing something. And I think that's really important. And there are so many strategies to address this hurdle to entry, creating markets and opportunities for entrepreneurs to test selling their wares on the weekends, creating incubators, small business incubators. There are a lot of ways in which communities are doing this and creating the space for retail. But at the end of the day, it comes down to, are there people there shopping and spending their resources?
Thank you. Claire, amongst the semi-recently, not that recently, opened new concept of connection between stores and city in the past few years in New York, which ones are most impressive to you? I'm thinking from, of course, the Chelsea market is not that new, but also the Essex Street market. Are there any that you find particularly interesting, also in the other boroughs?
I think what's been, we could debate these, but what I've been really intrigued by the meatpacking district in particular, not because the retail started there was more interesting, but because of the fact that people go there because there's less cars and they hang out, and then you've seen a lot of the empty storefronts there are now starting to house kind of more experiments in what a store should be, like combining art. So what's happened, I think, is empty storefronts in neighborhoods that were very expensive are now starting to kind of break open a little bit. The other thing that's popped up, which I thought was really interesting, is the North Tribeca Gallery.
Oh my God, yeah, that's my corner.
Below Canal Scene.
I know.
It's also, again, it's because those are such great buildings.
They're great side streets.
And they're great side streets and lanes. And so I do feel like one thing that, whether it's from Jackson Heights or the Bronx, when you have a street that isn't huge, but you have a lane, a small street, one or two things go there, even like a coffee shop. And this is really what happened in Brooklyn, and things start to pop up. And part of the problem is the giant streets, the big streets, and I would include Fifth Avenue in that, are kind of a problem because they take they have to scream really loud to be interesting.
So it's interesting. You need to have a starter for the sourdough.
Yeah, and most people want kind of to walk around a district.
Yeah. No,
I mean,
it's
I know
important.
that footfall is important, but Hudson Yards is full of people, and I would argue it's not interesting. But in a lot of ways, many neighborhoods, including around the Essex Market, still has the Lower East Side.
Yeah.
So you have the Lower East Side, and then when you go into Essex Street Market, you see those same vendors, and they're happy, and people are there. So it's that combination of the Lower East Side and Essex Street Market that I think works really well.
Yeah. And it's interesting that you picked the Meatpacking District because it went through so many of the phases that we're discussing very fast. You know, was wonderful, then it was unbearable, then at the same time the High Line, then the pandemic, tough going, and now it becomes interesting again. So it's fascinating. Well, I'm going to open it up to the public. How many here own a store? Raise your hand. Not enough. Raise it. Raise it. Okay, so quite not that many, but quite a few. So that's fascinating that there are also some people from the other side here. And who wants to ask the first question? Questions from the audience? Yeah, please go ahead. The gentleman in the middle. There's going to be a mic coming to you. Actually, here it comes. No, you do need a mic because we need it. Yeah. Thank you.
This question is for Larissa and maybe also John, and really opening it up to the whole panel. But Larissa, I was really intrigued by this word camouflage that you used as it pertained to art in a potentially vacant storefront. So I'm just wondering, expanding that up to the most macro level, down to something as intimate as a singular entrepreneur, what do you mean by camouflage? Is it only holding space in some sort of subversive way until retail in its original form returns? And to what degree are these conversations we have about sustainability and empowering the entrepreneur also camouflage for some of the more pernicious components of capitalism and consumerism?
I think we're holding some space for the time being until we figure no one really has a crystal ball right now. And so this idea of camouflage is we're in a moment where a lot of people are waiting to see what happens. I do think we're likely, because of all the trends I talked about, we're likely going to see a softening, and we're seeing it, a softening of demand for all of this space we've built. We, as a nation, are overbuilt in retail. So per capita, we have 24 square feet, more or less, per capita in this country. That's double or triple what our European partners have, right? So we're always going to have vacant space. And in a Midtown environment, I can't tell you whether this corner or that corner is going to remain vacant, in the next 2 to 3 years. So this idea of camouflage is about enlivening and hiding in some ways the gaps that are probably inevitable, and then allowing, and whether we agree or don't on sort of the question of capitalism, but allowing the time and space to determine what can go there that can be supported by the economics. And increasingly we're seeing, we have to think about outside of the box about what can go there. We need to be thinking about residential on the ground floor of streets that probably didn't have residential before. We need to be thinking about community facilities. We need to potentially civic spaces. I'm agnostic on some of that, but I think it's inevitable that these spaces are going to have new lives because there just isn't enough demand. There isn't enough discretionary spending to support all the retail that we have in our cities right now. And that's what I mean by camouflage.
I'm gonna, yeah, Marco?
Thank you so much for this. Thinking of all the dark stores are opening also in the city, all these mini distribution centers.
Dark stores?
Like, what is it, like Gorillas or 5-minute delivery?
Oh,
like
I didn't
like
know
all
that
these
they were
things.
called that
They're
way.
taking a lot of
Those
vacant
dark
space.
stores, yeah.
Dark kitchens too, but also going all the way to flea markets and vintage stores where it's more transparent. What's the role of vintage or reused retail, I guess, in the digital world and also in the physical space where people would go to a vintage store to have a communication or as you mentioned, like a living room communication with humans, or what's the role of flea markets or vintage stores or used used products, I guess.
Who wants to
these
answer?
new spaces?
Claire, Hazel, John? Maybe Claire, or no, John? You wanna?
Well, you're touching upon many ideas there. First of all, vintage or used is also about repairing clothes and making them sustainable. Repairing clothes is something that's growing in trend. It's the hottest thing. In our new store in Regent Street, the repair shop is the hottest department in the store. And the repair shop is bringing back the techniques 400 years old of repairing things with art, in an art form. So it's not just repairing it, but repairing it with beauty and repairing it with decoration and repairing it. So that's part of the whole sustainability opportunity. So that's only a small piece of it, of course. So I can't speak so much about flea markets and everything because I live there and I do too much of shopping there myself.
So
I wanted just to mention Montreal. I went there recently, and there's a way more vibrant retail culture there than, except for a couple of neighborhoods in Brooklyn. And I wanted to ask you all, why in Montreal, which is a garment city, why does it seem, and maybe because landlords ask for less rent, but it's incredible how repair in Montreal, food down the street, mixing all sorts of goods, there's just like not that many people live there, and there's just endless interesting stores and people walking around looking at stores.
who knows about Montreal?
I can tackle that.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that the question, one of the things we see is this sort of credit to character continuum, which is
Credit to character.
So in the United States and particularly institutional landlords have to rent to credit tenants, which may be sort of the more boring tenants, right? Because banks have certain requirements that are embedded in their assumptions in terms of rent and the kind of tenant they can have. So I think in some cases that may be what's leading to some of the differences that we see in these two markets. If you don't have a requirement for a credit tenant, and a smaller landlord has a lot more flexibility. So I imagine we're talking about smaller landlords who can look for character over credit.
See, we're learning so much. Yeah, Hazel.
And just finally, I mean, I think vintage is also very much tied up with culture. Mm-hmm. You know, what is culturally appropriate? I mean, you can't shop vintage if you're poor, for example. You know, so there's lots of facets there. But I mean, certainly I think in cities in Canada, like in Europe, just vintage is more acceptable because of, well, lots and lots of, but principally cultural reasons, which we're just moving towards in the United States. But that's partly to do with the whole scale of, everything here, I think.
There's, let's go up there. Whoa, there's so many. Oh, others, are you, okay, sorry, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you all for this
I'll
amazing
let you decide,
conversation.
Helena.
John, you mentioned this idea of a smaller kitchen and the artisans that are coming out of there and actually able to sell food in spaces where they otherwise would not, with the help of Uber, of course. There's a similar situation right now in fashion, and presumably those small kitchens are challenging the Burger Kings and the McDonald's, and you have small artisan fashion brands challenging the Zaras and the H&Ms. What my business is doing is we're trying to bring those small independent fashion brands from around the world and make it easier for them to access vacancies, bring them together, use the UN Sustainable Development Goals as a framework for uniting them.
Question.
And my question is really, is there a breakthrough ahead in challenging the bigger companies of the world using vacant real estate?
It's already happened. It's called the internet. So you're there. You just have to have something that people want. That's the secret. Have something that people desire. And the internet will help you tell your story.
Do people desire surprise?
Of course they do.
Yeah,
of course,
they
unless
do.
they're dead. You know, so, no, of course.
And how do, I'm asking you this, I'm sorry if I'm taking a little time from you, but because you've been in so many different incarnations in retail, from working at Bloomingdale's to working at White & Kennedy and supporting Nike and now Uniqlo, blah, blah, blah. So how do big retailers, we know how Bloomingdale's and Saks Fifth Avenue did it with the windows, but how do big retailers create that surprise that attracts people and doesn't feel like everything is anodyne and
well, in the old days, it was called intuition and cultural curiosity before the internet, before that you could Pinterest everything, before you could cheat and sit on the computer and think you can learn about culture by skimming across the top of it, by Googling everything. It meant you went out and met people, for God's sake, and you traveled and you went to real places and so forth. So I think surprises there can be many levels. I want to take two of the things that you showed and put them together. Sarah, our hero of the queen of the select store, and the blankets, the people were selling goods around the corner of your apartment. In Harajuku is this famous area in Tokyo, which was very important to retail and fashion and so forth in the 90s. There used to be on the main street blankets right up and down the street on both sides. Each blanket was manned by a young entrepreneur, a young Sarah, a young select store, a young person in the old days that Bendels would have found on a Thursday when Gertrude would bring new designers into the store. These people were sitting on the ground with a blanket, and each one was showing their select vision of retail. It was amazing. It was amazing.
Next one.
I grew up in New Jersey, and now there's this like American Dream Mall, and you know, I noticed this is kind of like a trend now with like, you know, there are retail places, but that have like roller coasters or a water park. And even in, you know, there's like the Museum of Illusions now in meatpacking. And I wondered if you felt like that was a trend and like how we feel about it.
Who wants to answer? Claire? Marisa? Yeah.
Yes. You know, we have increasingly been seeing retail or entertainment as retail, you know, and in fact, right now we're doing work in Union Square in San Francisco, which has been devastated by the pandemic. You know, the vacancy rates are 30% and higher. There's been, you know, there are lots of stories of smash and grab and looting. And part of it is that people are not returning to these places because the mass market merchant, in particular, you can shop those things in other places. You can go to your nearest mall for H&M. You don't need to go to Union Square anymore. So what is it that makes places unique? You know, the fun of it, the entertainment of it. And we're seeing those concepts all over. You walk down in Soho, and I just talked to the head of the Soho Business Improvement District last week who said he's seeing you know, cultural concepts, the Museum of Ice Cream, you know, the Museum of Sex, the Museum of Illusion. I mean, name the museum, and they're filling spaces that otherwise would have gone to retailers. But now, since the market has softened, there are opportunities and openings. So we absolutely are seeing that. What's the thing you can't do online, right? These are the things that we're seeing in our spaces, in our storefronts.
Claire, you want to say?
And I think that's where, yes, you can have a Museum of Ice Cream or you can have MoMA, but it's really the district. It's really the districts. New York City used to have a diamond district, a flower district, a ladies' mile, you know, the department store district. And in a way, Meatpacking's an example, but so's Fulton Mall and a number of other things, which is that things happen on the street too, smaller, like you have a big leaf festival with flowers. A lot of people show up, and some of the people go to who's selling certain things and discover something, and they might start following them on Instagram or other things. So I do think that idea of being outside the store ultimately does benefit the store, but it's a little bit Wild West right now. I don't think there's not a kind of calibration of it. So sometimes it is the roller coaster in the mall, and other times it's, you know, like the best kind of barbecue or food or music festival you've ever gone to. And those two worlds are just way too far apart.
Or in the meatpacking district, it's the High Line as
Or the High Line.
experience, or it's the Whitney as the experience. So,
That's
you know,
so
there's
true.
the high end and the low end of this, you know, entertainment. But, you know, ultimately, those things are helping to drive visitation too.
Hi. I wanted to, I love the nostalgia of going back to the merchant, and I think the sentiment is definitely about the person as curator who's looked at objects for whomever they may be curating for. But I think the nefarious part of that is there was a gatekeeper element to that in the old days, and so certain elements of culture were allowed to be put forward into the stores and into the wider culture. And so the democratization element of the internet allows all kinds of ideas and fashion trends to come out. And so, John, I would ask you as a consummate merchant and creative director, how do you negotiate that tension as we sit in a temple of high culture? What does that mean to go back to the merchant as a curator in the mass world of retailing? Because it is really nice to have the objects d'art and opening ceremony, but those are very expensive.
You just have to find things you love, just show your passion. That's what a true merchant is, someone that is incredibly passionate about the things that he wants or she wants to present to you. That's really important, and the passion comes from not only the product, but in the service and how it's presented to you as well. So it can be anything. I mean, a merchant can be representing any product category, but there has to be a true personal passion for whatever it is that they're trying to present.
And
I know that sounds simplistic, but...
No, but you know, you've seen it with Sarah, with the Casa Magazine's people. That it's true, and it's Helena. It's Helena. I cannot take responsibility.
Okay, I'll go back. It's less of a question. It's actually more of a comment.
We don't like comments.
Oh, I didn't know that. The first time.
You make it in
then I'm going to ask very
30
fast.
seconds.
Very fast. I think one of the biggest problems for New York is the scaffolding, because I do think it sends out this tremendous message that the city is kind of on crutches, and it's the first thing that people see. And so I've been wondering, can this please, why do we have them, and could they go away? And the second thing is, I think it would help artisans and small stores tremendously if the city had a program, and I'm wondering if something is with the new mayor perhaps happening, that sort of emphasizes vocational training, so that all these people who do this incredible, like repairs, as we were talking about, could come back and animate the spaces.
I'm going to make it into a question. What do you think, Larissa?
I was looking at you because I think that's a great question on the scaffolding. You know, I know
I
you've
love
touched that issue.
scaffoldings. It means that the
I
city's
think-
in progress. I don't
Well,
like the trash bags. That's my
I
problem.
think the scaffolding's really evolved a lot.
Yeah.
You'll see.
I don't
this
like
new-
those Gothic
There's
ones.
like the new kind of
The neo-Gothic are
scaffolding, the
terrible.
old scaffolding.
I like the old ones.
But yeah, I think that's where New York gets to be like Rome. It's constantly under repair, and it's actually going to get even more so. But really, dining. One of the reasons I brought up dining is outdoor dining helped stores also, and it helped restaurants. So by having everyone out on the street dining, it turned out, I know that I acquired my favorite knapsack because I was going to a restaurant, and I saw it, like, so in a way, getting people out. And so that evolution, including scaffolding, actually has kept the rain off a lot of people. A lot of people use scaffolding to operate
Right.
outside. So I'm
Yeah,
not sure.
that's so true.
I'm not sure it's totally negative.
But I
Beauty's
like
in
your
the eye of the
vocational
beholder.
training comment.
Beauty's in the eye of the beholder.
No, but you know, the vocational training part is marked as a ingredient. Yeah.
Question for you, John Jay. No, Jay.
John
Jay.
yeah.
Jay. I am baffled as to the reason why stores such as Tiffany that have very distinct like headquarters. This is a term that I coined called beigeization, as the color beige, that they totally erase their iconic look, and they all have become. I mean, you could be at a Beverly Hills, you could be Singapore.
So what is your question?
What's the reason behind retailers that had like an iconic look, a headquarter, like
changing? Okay.
No, not only changing, erasing that and making all the stores look the same. That's horrible. I mean, that is as horrific a retail tragedy as not as horrific as the demise of the bookstore.
What is your answer? If you noticed it, if you didn't notice it, you can say, "Oh, I didn't notice it."
Well, there's a lot of radical change happening. So you mentioned Tiffany's, it's having to try to find its future. And they're going through some very radical marketing, radical repositioning and so forth. Some of you may hate it and some of you may like it. They are all playing upon the success of previous turnarounds of luxury stores and luxury brands, and they're playing that game. The only thing I would say is that they can never give up Robin's Egg Blue because they own that, and Hermes can never give up on orange because they own that, and somehow they earn the right to own a color somehow. So I think that's something they can never change. So they can make it 10 stories high or 1 story or whatever, but color is emotional and color is a part of their signature, so they need to keep their color.
And I have to say I feel for Tiffany's because for 4 years they did not exist. They were obliterated by our president because nobody could get there. It was terrible. I kind of felt for them. Okay, next question. Yeah?
I got a microphone.
Talk, yeah, it's you.
Would you say that merchants do more than just curate? They actually sell stuff.
Yeah. Who wants to answer?
Yeah, please, someone else.
Hazel, you answer.
Well, I mean, I certainly think, going back to my example of Geraldine Stutz, I mean, she was a very interesting example, and I mean, you know much more than I do, but of someone who just did the whole package, but it was for a very specific clientele. I think, one had to acknowledge that. I think that's probably part of, selling, that you need to, you need to be targeting, if you're a merchant, on who you want your customer to be. I don't think you can. It's not my realm, but I don't think you can necessarily open it up to all comers. So I think those successful merchants have also, they've done both, but like Colette, with a very specific clientele in mind.
A great merchant is a great salesperson. Absolutely, absolutely, because that's part of the passion.
They still have to sell something that people want to buy.
Exactly.
At the end of the day, I think that's true. And, at some point, the salesperson of typewriters, the merchant who sold typewriters was no longer in the business of selling typewriters. There was a store in my neighborhood in Jackson Heights when I moved there, and this very large storefront, and all he sold were porcelain figurines. And they were dusty. They were beautiful, but they were dusty. No one's buying porcelain figurines anymore. Eventually, he sold the store, and now it's a bank. It's a chicken store, a chicken franchise. Chicken. And I think those are the two things. They split it up into two. But retail is transformative, and over time it changes, and over time people buy and sell different things. So, you can be a great salesperson, but you also have to think about the thing that you're selling. And a great salesperson is going to try to sell the thing that people are buying.
You brought up bodegas, but the other passion I have in New York is for stationery stores. And because of so much digitally, New York City has the office supply store, and there is an amazing, still holding on there, really interesting set of office supply stores in the Garment District, other places in New York, that you just walk in and you think, the time, very short here, but what interesting products.
A merchant is not just a singular person. I would ask everyone to go to Tokyo and go to Tokyo Hands.
Oh my God, Tokyo Hands. Great.
the most passionate salespeople in the world that know everything about the subject. Now, this person only knows about screwdrivers, but he knows or she knows everything about screwdrivers. And you walk in that store and you want a screwdriver, you're in heaven. And you can pick 1,000 other subjects. Every single salesperson has been trained to be deeply knowledgeable about that product. And you feel a sense of confidence and camaraderie and sense of, just friendship there. So, I mean, I ask everyone, you made the question, but do they have something that you want to buy? So for all of us creative people who are out there thinking of metaverse and all, you have to have something that people want to buy, you have to have something that people desire to have, and you have to have the skills and the manners and respect to sell it respectfully and have good manners. When was the last time you had good service in this town? That is a problem. And if elected, no, I was just...
All right, we have time for one more, okay?
Well, mine kind of brings a lot of the points in full circle. The greedy landlord, the rooftop where the people live, and the good service, right? And I used to live on the Upper West Side, which was full of little stores that were such community, and you'd go in and you would see beautiful things that you'd want to buy, and you need a last-minute present, etc. And they all, despite the fact that we had the residents, and despite the fact that there was money there for people to buy the stuff, it was squeezed out. The people couldn't, I knew stores that went and in desperation said, okay, we're going to do it in a truck now and maybe stay in the neighborhood.
So,
what can happen for that? For the neighborhoods that got squeezed out, that had the rooftops, that had the eyes, because it feels like that's dying in Manhattan.
Thank you.
Is that for me? No.
Yeah, I'm okay. Who can it be for?
There are a lot of questions sort of embedded with that. And one of the things that we looked at, and actually early in my career, I worked on the rezoning of 125th Street, which at the time was seeing a lot of changes in the retail. And this is before, what was happening, I think, on the Upper West Side. But, one of the things was that banks and drugstores were basically out competing, other retailers for space. And so we did a few things. We incorporated some restrictions on the storefront, the length of storefront that a bank could occupy, because you didn't want to walk past 50 feet of bank to get to the next
Those
store, right?
colors.
That 50 feet kills the shopping environment. So we did that. We forced retail up, we forced banks to have second floor space. So we want to push up that space to the second floor. So that became embedded in the zoning code. We tried to focus on, drugstores, on limiting drugstores as well. There's sort of other elements. And then, one of the issues is smaller space. These smaller retailers need smaller space. So when you have new development and you have much larger spaces, sometimes it's harder to fill it with smaller space. And that new space is often higher, as higher rent space to begin with. So some of it is just this cycle, this cyclical, it's competition for space, right? Property owners are going to try to find a way to rent, if they can, to the highest bidder. And that's what, some of what we're seeing on the Upper West Side. And we do have, and that's a great example, Gail Brewer, who is a council person, who was then borough president, really advanced a number of zoning initiatives that tried to address that. I don't know if they were particularly successful, but some of it is, we then ultimately see change in that, over time, the banks no longer are occupying, they're not creating the same problem they were creating in some of these environments. So it's a really hard thing to solve for, right? Because we try to change the zoning and we try to fix it, and then zoning sticks around for 20, 30 years, and then the problem we tried to solve for, we created another problem. So it's like a game of whack-a-mole to try to fix this thing that you're talking about. So I wish I had a better answer for you.
No, but you kind of give an answer to all the issues that we discussed tonight. It's a matter of flexibility and adaptability, and maybe it's a different system of legislating. It's a different system of leasing it's a different system of like also organizing stores, and it's incredibly fascinating. Also, it's a different system of merchandise, because we've been talking also about stores where you go to repair, so maybe you bring your own garments to repair and you pay a fee to enter. Who knows? What I think has transpired tonight is that it's an incredibly exciting, complicated, but incredibly exciting landscape. I mean, the landscape of retail is crucial for the future, as it's always been. But I feel that it's going to be also the place of experimentation more than the workplace, for sure. And I'm so happy that we've had this conversation. And I, for one, can't wait for Century 21 to reopen next year. If you can, but if you can convince opening ceremony to come back, I would always also be incredibly happy. So, as you know, as usual, we have our mediocre wine and so-so snacks outside waiting for us. I would like to thank my fabulous panelists, Hazel Clark, John Jay, Larissa Ortiz, and Claire Weiss, and the fabulous video makers and the MoMA staff and Helena Claiborne for making tonight happen. Let's go outside and have drinks. Thank you so much.